Hey everybody, did you know this is a show called nOne-shot with Mark J? It's my very special podcast with my very special guest. nOne-shot is all about uplifting the voices of POC in the TTRPG space. And that's what we're here to do tonight. We're especially going to be talking about Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate came out maybe 2 months ago by Larian Games, and it is controversial to say the least. A lot of people love it, very few people hate it. It's got about a 96 on Metacritic, and it could be slated to be one of the games of the years, despite some of the issues people are having with it. There's been quite a bit of controversy, especially the reaction to people of color who've talked about Baldur's Gate 3 in a negative, or I should just say a critical light. But this evening, I have some very special guests, and we are here to talk to you about Baldur's Gate 3. Maybe some of the things we love about it, maybe some things we like a little less about it. But either way, here are my guests, amazing as they are. Lyndon, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
All right. Hi, I'm Lyndon. I also go by Tadpole. As mentioned earlier, I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a Singaporean Chinese tabletop RPG writer. I've published prose. As you can see from the humble brag that was streaming earlier, I've actually published multiple proses in anthologies that are recognized under Singapore's ESRB, which means that I'm actually like a published writer for Singapore, which is actually extremely rare. I'm also published under Wormlings, which is a recently funded Kickstarter for all ages tabletop RPG. I've been playing 5e for about 6 years now, and I know Forgotten Realms very, very well. I know you can't see it, but like on my right, there are 7 4e books that are purely for the lore, and I just purchased them because I wanted to read them. So I wanted to weigh in on Baldur's Gate 3 and just everything that's gone up to it, because I had friends that were very excited. They've been playing since early access. They've been talking about it so consistently that when the full game came out, I was like, I want to join them. And I bought the game and I got in and it was 115 gigabytes. And I was like, oh, that's a little unfortunate. But I did manage to get through about the first act before my laptop couldn't take it anymore. So I do have some thoughts about how I felt up until right before the Goblin Camp, because my laptop is old. It's struggling with the amount of space that Baldur's Gate takes, unfortunately. So my experience is only limited to about the first act, where with limited partners. So there's also that. As much as I love Karlek, I never got to find her. I never got to find her in my playthrough, and I'm devastated about it. So there's that. I'm devastated. I never got to see the buff wife. But yeah. All to
That's
you,
so
Stefan.
mean that Larian Games fried your laptop before you could get to your favorite PC. That's just
I know.
cruel. Actually, it might have been Karlek burning to find you.
Oh
and then
yeah,
she
hey,
melted
no,
your
that's
PC.
good
Yeah,
catch.
who
good
knows?
catch.
There's just no way you could find her.
Her passion was burning so bright, my laptop couldn't update itself. So
Karlek does that.
She just got a little
She's
upset.
too passionate.
Oh my goodness. Stefan, would you be so kind of introduce yourself as well? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Stefan. I am a educator. I teach history, many types of history, but one of my focus things that I focus on is popular culture. I have been playing TTRPG since 1977. Been playing the Forgotten Realms since it premiered. And I played Baldur's Gate from the early access. I wrote a master's thesis on race and gender in early tabletop role-playing games. And for Baldur's Gate, I have 2 characters deep into the 3rd act and one that's just barely in the 2nd act. So I've been played a little bit. And there's a lot to talk about in regards to race and racism, not only with the Forgotten Realms, but with Baldur's Gate 3 in particular. So happy to be here and talk about that.
I appreciate so much all my guests being here. It actually means a lot because it's hard to get this thing off the ground and organized. As y'all know, anytime you try to organize anyone in the TTRPG space, whew, it's not easy.
Scheduling is the BBEG.
The CR40
is.
monster.
Yes.
So I would like to begin then, because you mentioned the Forgotten Realms a time or two. I would like to kind of go broad before we focus in on the game a little bit more. Forgotten Realms, I'm pretty new to it. Stefan might have more insight into it, but it's been problematic for a couple of years. I think my introduction to it has been R.A. Salvatore's books, the Drizzt books, from way back when. Drizzt was our favorite drow. He's our special drow who could do no wrong, was lawful good, despite being in a world of chaotic evil. The drow women are all drow are dark elves. They're dark skin, black skin, sometimes described as dark gray. They all live underground in a sunless society. They worship a spider goddess who is evil. It's a matriarchal society, and the whole society revolves around backstabbing each other, essentially. I think in each family, you're only allowed to have one or two males. And if there are other males born, you just kill them. So that was my introduction to the Forgotten Realms, was this world of these evil people, evil dark-skinned people, with this one good drow who overcame the odds and escaped this world into this bright, shining world of blonde-haired, blue-eyed dwarves and barbarians, etc., etc. However, the world is way much more than Drizzt, thankfully. I just want to get where you guys come in with Forgotten Realms, a little bit of what your thoughts are, just how you've experienced as players so far.
I can start first.
Please.
I started from 3.5e, actually Pathfinder. So I started from Pathfinder First Edition, and I had no context of the lore at all because we weren't even playing in the Forgotten Realms. I started as a tiefling. I looked up the list and I was like, wow, you can mix and match things. I didn't even think about like the racism about Forgotten Realms until I got to 5e. And then I got made fun of because I was playing the same tiefling, and my DM was like, oh, you can't have feathery wings. Asura don't exist in the Forgotten Realms. And it just kind of set off like a whole cycle of me reading up extensively about the Forgotten Realms to justify why a race that is meant to be demonic and devilish doesn't have crow wings in a world where it's fantastical and interesting. And this is like from a Singaporean Chinese person to another Singaporean Chinese person. It's not even something that's related to like race per se. It's just an ingrained perception of you can't do this. Even if it's just a cosmetic thing, you can't do this. It's not supposed to be there. And that was kind of why I started deep diving very deeply into the lore, because I realized that players, when they come into this world, they just think that they're a static being with NPCs that have set voice lines like in a MMO, and there's no consequence to them doing anything in this world because, oh, if all else fails, I can just kill them. It's not even anything. It's just the escalation of conflict is always, I can just kill them without consequence because I'm the hero and the main character of this narrative. So that was kind of like my introduction to the Forgotten Realms and how it went out. It was only until much later that I found out about the Dragonlance novels, specifically about the Draconians, and that was very intriguing for me. What about the others?
Yeah, I started playing the Forgotten Realms right from the beginning. When it premiered, it first came out, and it kind of came in as a replacement for previous settings in Dungeons and Dragons, and to establish kind of a more detailed, kind of larger, purpose-built setting for Dungeons and Dragons. like the settings that came before it, it's highly Eurocentric, right? It mimics Europe in many ways when you look at the map, and then it puts a Europe analog in the west. Then we're going to have like an Arabian analog down to the south, and Asian analog to the east, right? Very much structured, similar to a real world kind of thing that puts what the Sword Coast, which mimics Europe in a great many ways, kind of front and center in the narrative. And a great many longtime fans and new fans of the Forgotten Realms do a great deal of pearl clutching by saying that the racism that is inherent in the Forgotten Realms is just part of the lore. That's just the way the world is. And so that should, in their minds, just sort of excuse the racism because it's part of what it is. Now, to be fair, I think, and I've known some clever GMs who have been able to tell some really great stories kind of using the racism of the Forgotten Realms to kind of mirror real world problems. Where it gets dicey is when people just want to use racism as nothing more than a set piece and an excuse to do awful things. And unfortunately, that's all too often what it becomes. It just becomes a justification for people to act racist and then be able to brush it off as, yeah, but that's just the way people are in the Forgotten Realms. That's just how it is. And unfortunately, I think that's what kind of comes through with some people, particularly those staunchly defending Baldur's Gate 3 in the context of the game, is that they justify it as something that people shouldn't be making a big deal out of, because that's just how the Forgotten Realms is. That's just how Githyanki are. That's just the way Illithid are. That's the way it should be. And it becomes problematic because I've played into the third act of the game. I've encountered some characters and some situations that others who haven't gotten that far have, that make the kind of essentialist issues of just saying that, well, that's just the way that race is, even more problematic because of the way Lyrian decided to frame a couple of key characters in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my history with D&D and tabletop RPGs in general dates back to about 5 years ago, kind of just before pre-pandemic, before kind of like I feel like there's a big TTRPG explosion during the pandemic, and I kind of happened to be in like about a year or two before that. And the one thing that I kind of felt in my overall experience was that the Forgotten Realms were kind of considered default when I kind of walked in. This idea of like, oh, it felt default. Like your default world is going to be the Forgotten Realms. Your default world is going to be this very Eurocentric type thing, which was, kind of strange, because then I looked at D&D and was like, oh, well, there's, monsters and demons and deities from all kinds of cultures. Like, you could have biblical monsters and you could have Hindu asuras. Like, you could have everything under the sun in this game. And so I was like, what's going on here? And I think part of why people start to like feel like, oh, well, the racism is supposed to be there is because it is that feeling of default, or like, and like talking about racism is not a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when you start to do some like white saviorism, like Retzef pointed out in the chat. It is a bad thing when it is, like Stefan said, a set piece, right? So I was, like this kind of, that's always been like how I've interacted with the Forgotten Realms, is it's always felt very default, for lack of a better word. And like, the way that people kind of like treat that and expect that like, oh, well, like, yeah, that racism should be there. Like that's how it's supposed to be. Like it, it's just weird. It's just janky.
and it's important to note that from 4E on, Forgotten Realms is the default setting for D&D. That's why they put the D&D movie in the Forgotten Realms and all that other things. So
okay, so it actually
is it is the default. Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
you
that's
know,
interesting.
there you go. It's kind of baked in at that point, you know, and it's just like that's so. Yeah, that was how I experienced it. That's I showed up after 5e, obviously, so like that's exactly how I experienced it. Was this is how this game is. Welcome to D&D. We have racism, and I was like, what? What is happening here? And Red Seven Chat is also saying, like, in the third act, it really ups the issues that POCs face, showing how refugees are treated, and even you can see how tieflings are treated as refugees in Act 1.
Absolutely.
Just to kind of bring in our chat Baldur's Gate 3 expert into the conversation. So yeah, it's weird. One of the things I tell my clients a lot is because the racism is so baked into D&D, there are a lot of attempts to kind of divest from that and to move away from that. And those are all admirable and encouraged. I always support my clients when they want to do that stuff. But the one note that I always give them is it's baked in. It's kind of hard to take out things that are baked in because your players will come at it with assumptions, right? Like, again, because you have got this default that, D&D as a product, WotC as a product, like all of these, and Larian as a, company has also agreed to use as this kind of base default. It is, like I said, I love my clients to death. I always encourage them to do the work that they're doing because it's important, but it's tricky, right? Like, how do you convince people who've interacted with Baldur's Gate 3 to start to think about removing the racism from their games, right?
Well, yeah, 100%. And because it's so huge, and spoiler alert for people who aren't in the third act of the game, certainly there are two key figures that really kind of get at me because, first off, the very first NPC that you're going to encounter in the game, anybody who started up the game knows that Lae'zel is the first NPC you're going to run into, right? The first character that can be a companion for you, and Lae'zel is a Githyanki. And Githyanki are a very old in D&D lore. They go all the way back to like the early days of D&D. They were a race that was enslaved by the Illithid, by the Mind Flayers, for a very long time until a woman named Githyanki woman, kind of freed them from that servitude. And then they had a division with the Githyanki following kind of the tenets of Gith, and the Githzerai going off on kind of a splinter. And the Githyanki are one of the many races in D&D. Mark mentioned the Drow earlier, who I'll always point out in the very early lore are very clearly stated in the Fiend Folio, one of the early monster manuals for D&D, that the Drow were as dark and evil as their surface dwelling kin were light and good. Setting up that parallel that, darkness equals evil, dark skin equals evil, light skin equals good, so on and so forth. But Githyanki are another one of the races, much like the Illithid, who you will hear a lot of talk, and particularly in the debate about Baldur's Gate 3, well, they're just made that way. That's the way they are, right? The Illithid are evil because they were made evil and because they have to consume the brains of sentience, of other thinking beings. The Githyanki are evil and bad because of their culture. Like, their culture makes them that way, right? The problem, as if that wasn't problem enough in itself, just kind of that bioessentialist, like, you are what you are because of what you were born into, and you can't change that. Sorry, done. The problem that really sticks out for me in Baldur's Gate 3 is both with Lae'zel and with a character that you encounter later on in the game called the Emperor, who's an Illithid. And they both conform to a particular archetype of POC characters, and they both are, depending on how you play with Lae'zel, I should add. And your encounters with the Emperor, they can both come out to be one of the good ones. Essentially, they become very much like what Mark described Drizzt as being, as people who, despite all of this pearl clutching that these races must be a particular way, well, here are some examples who were able to break away from that. And they're one of the good ones, right? And this is a trope and an ideology that POC have faced for as long as we can remember, right? That we're just a particular way. All of the caveats you hear about POC, whether it's laziness or whatever, or we're a particular thing, but then there are some who are the good ones, right? They can break away from the standard biology that's going to keep the rest of them, conforming to this. And what you get with like these two characters is very much that with Lae'zel and the Emperor, is you get these examples of, depending on how your character plays, they can break away from their culture, they can break away from their things. And it's even made worse in the case of the Githyanki, because the game gives you an opportunity to find, to at one point you can find or not the Githyanki, the Illithid, you can find an Illithid who's newly awakened. And one of the quest lines you can go on is you can go on a quest line to get a dead body to feed that Illithid a brain, right? Which completely shoots down now the whole thing that that it's a biological imperative that they consume the brains of living creatures, right? And so there's a lot of these like problematic exceptions throughout Baldur's Gate 3. Like the bioessentialism by itself is bad enough, but then when you add on this extra layer of, but here are these examples that can break away from that, and they're just exceptions to the rule.
I think that it's also worth mentioning that the opening with like the illithid tadpole being forcibly installed into your brain is like a metaphor to assault. So like you are forced into like a race against time to just solve that issue. You can feel it. It's mentioned multiple times, and there are multiple paths you can take. You can embrace this assault that you have no control over, or you can reject it, and then you become weaker. And Larian has openly stated it's open-ended, but it's kind of clear what they want, considering there's a branching tree for the.
You gain powers, You gain powers from like the tadpole eventually.
The parallel kind of thing there is pretty obvious when you kind of pause and think about like what that is implying, right? This idea of like, I'm just gonna say it, a forced pregnancy, and it's like there's a very clear equivalency there. I'm gonna jump really quickly backwards for half a sec because there was an interesting question in the chat from Retsev. Question for those who know the lore: how accurate are the Githyanki represented in Baldur's Gate 3?
Pretty darn accurate.
Actually, at least,
from the lore, the Githyanki, the way the Githyanki culture and society works, it's pretty accurate to what's in the lore.
Yeah, they're unfortunately quite cultish. I hate to use that word, but they are quite cult-like.
Good word.
So that does check out with like Lae'zel's behavior and like her actions as a soldier, even in the first act where she pretty much condones all violence, which is very Githyanki because they value martial strength above all else.
Yep.
So that's pretty much their attitude when it comes to how to deal with things, because they're not talkers. They think that direct action is the best solution to everything, and so violence works.
Yeah.
I was going to say Retsev put in there, and you have the option to gain more tadpoles, which is absolutely true. You can kill other people that have tadpoles, and if you choose to go down the road, now you don't have to choose to accept the tadpole's powers, but if you choose to accept this new level of powers, it unlocks a whole new power tree that you can access, and you can kill other people infected with tadpoles, or find them, around where they've been killed and take those tadpoles and consume them, and then unlock more levels of powers by doing that.
Yeah. There's one in Act 1 where he was dying, and he actually asked you to kill him so that
Yes.
you can take care of his siblings. And you do have the choice to send the siblings to their deaths so that you can absorb the tadpole
Yep.
of the dead
Yep.
person. So that's also something that is relatively messed up, because once again you're assaulting this corpse that has begged you to give him a mercy death, and
Yep.
and in front of his siblings who are trying to give him a funeral, which is a lot to unpack in one sentence, but here we are, I suppose.
It is.
You
And
know,
I will say, I was just going to say, in Lyrian's defense, man, there's a lot of choices in this game. Like a lot of choices that matter. Just to say that in some games, you make choices whether it's good or evil, and ultimately you end up in the same place, right? Like you go back to like Knights of the Old Republic or Mass Effect or something like that, and if you take the quote unquote evil or the quote unquote good choice, maybe there's some immediate change, like you get more money up front. Whereas if you took the good choice, some day later, that person who you said, "Oh, you don't owe me anything," comes back and gives you a nice piece of armor or something like that, right? But like you make some evil choices in this game, and you will seriously make the game a lot harder and hinder yourself. Like killing off your companions, killing off like all of the tiefling refugees, which you can totally do. It's gonna hurt you down the road.
Which is definitely a good thing to have, is to make it very clear. It's like it's a good thing in the sense of like knowing that taking the evil route means that you are going to have a harder time. But at the same time, I like this is the thing that I do with clients all the time, is I wonder, is it even worth displaying that route? Like, is that, I'm like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? But these are the kinds of questions that I think when we are creating games, we have to ask ourselves, is what is the benefit of like allowing a player to explore this type of route where they get to do all these harmful things? What are they actually gaining from participating in these things and from that narrative, right? And especially when it comes to fantasy games like Baldur's Gate 3, it's very easy to kind of disconnect from reality and be like, oh, it's just a tadpole in my brain, and not see the equivalencies, right?
Sure.
And so that's why I always try to bring it back to real world equivalencies, right? The idea of dark skinned people being evil in the Forgotten Realms is colorism, right? That is the real world equivalency, because people of color are seen as evil, as suspect, as criminal, right? So that is something that is real in our world, that exists in this game. The idea that, you are forcibly infected with this tadpole there is a real world equivalency. And when you start to look at games that you are playing and things that you are interacting with by taking them out of their fantasy setting and putting them back into your real world setting, you may realize that your answers change, right? You may realize that, like, oh, killing off all of the tieflings, maybe you were cool with that. But the moment you look around you and go, well, what if the tieflings were South Asian people? And what if I killed off every South Asian person, right? Would I be okay with that? And so like there's this kind of this, like, because we consider it fantasy, there's this almost like disinhibition that can happen. I always try to pull it back and be like, no, here's your real world, here's your actual real world equivalent. I'm not just making this out of nothing. I'm giving you things that are actually existing in the real world that have slid their way into this game, so that you can understand what it is that you are doing when you interact with those storylines and with those mechanics, right?
I think that's like super important. And I think, I give at least Lyrian a level of credit, because I think that when you're dealing with any sort of fiction, I think you can tackle some really weighty issues like the ones you address, but you've got to do it with care, and there's got to be a certain level of guidance, which unfortunately is not there a lot of the time, which is why it can be so often problematic, because it's not there. But like there's a real example within the game. In the second act, you fight a combat, and if you lose that combat, there's a key NPC. It's not someone that you can recruit as a companion that you can travel with, but there's someone that can remain in your camp. And if that character dies in that combat, it brings about a whole chain of events to where the refuge that the tieflings are hiding in eventually in the game is wiped out by these dark forces that show up, and they kill pretty much everyone.
Okay.
Um, you can choose to also like side with the evil side and kind of participate in that as well. And so what happens is eventually you'll go through a whole nother chain of events that you have to like complete. But eventually there's another major combat, right? Where if you do not protect that village, if you do not keep that village up, you're going to show up to that battle and it's going to be just you and one other NPC to fight an entire, like a pretty significant force of enemies that's uh, um, without you like. And I've seen people do all kinds of wild things with the game where they can generate like tons of damage, but for the ordinary player it's going to be a battle that you might not win it. But if you do save that NPC or you don't wipe out the tieflings, then there's a small army on your side in that battle. And I think there's, again, while there's certainly debate to be had about exploring these things, I think there's a level of value to show consequences for evil actions in that way, that if you choose to take that evil route, you're going to have to fight this battle and you might not get through it. But if you don't take that route, you're going to have these allies on your side and that combat is going to be far, far easier. And there's a certain
I definitely
value there
appreciate the
demonstrating that.
consequences.
Yeah,
I
and
definitely
I
appreciate the
that.
consequences aspect for sure.
Yeah. And that happens at multiple times throughout the game, that if you make certain choices, again, in other games, it's just like, well, okay, you were evil or you were good. Maybe you got access to some different powers and the color of your ending was different, right? But this game throughout has these consequences for like, hey, sorry, you decided to wipe these people out. You're not going to have a place where you can rest. You're not going to have a place where you can buy materials, and you're not going to have a place where, you know, allies that are going to help you through these things. It's going to be a lot harder. As a matter of fact, I read an article on one of the game sites, and they decided to try 3 extreme play styles. And one of the extreme play styles that they chose to play was, I am going to reject or kill every companion. I am going to do the evil thing at every single point. And he basically said, I could have kept playing, but by the time I got to about 4th or 5th level, the game was practically unplayable because everything was too hard. And I appreciate that they like went into that level to show that, yeah, you can totally do that. Kill everybody off. Don't have any companions. Solo it by yourself. Go for it. But guess what? It's going to be rough.
Yeah, that's very cool. Speaking of, there is a question from Pendacabra in chat that says, how does that affect something like a Dark Urge player character where it's strongly implied that you're a pretty evil person to begin with? I know there are new choices and it's a matter of do you resist your evil nature or not. Also, why my current playthrough is with the Black Elf. Can either of you speak to like the decision making with Dark Urges?
I think I've not tried out the Dark Urge path yet, but I've had enough people around me play the Dark Urge to understand what's going on. It's not really the fact that you're an inherent evil person by nature. It's more of a force that's beyond your control. It's a pretty big spoiler. I think it's like it's only reviewed like down the line. So it's kind of a bit like an analogy of like mental illness per se, where you aren't in control. You are basically a passenger when it comes to these things, which is why it's a urge. It's a dark urge where you aren't in control of yourself. And I think that it's also mentioned that you are essentially sleepwalking when these acts occur. Like the character isn't in control. It always happens at night when you're supposed to be resting. So it's kind of a toss for me knowing the spoiler, because it's a bit of an echo to the original Baldur's Gate, where the main character also had something similar going on with him. So so that's kind of how I feel about it. Is kind of this it's great that Laren allows us the path of like, hey, you're clearly like mentally ill. This is bad. You're sleepwalking, and there's a lot of violence. Your companions even step in to stop you if you have enough rapport with them. They actually do step in to like keep you safe and not end up committing these acts while you're not in control. So there is like a good and bad dichotomy, as Stefan mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
that if you do enough good and you build enough rapport with your companions, they are actually actively trying to save you from this influence.
Yeah.
And if you don't, they die for your actions. Yeah, they do.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately,
Yep.
like it's
Jeez.
one of the byproducts. It's very high stakes. That path, I believe, is very high stakes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my perspective of what I know without going into too much spoilers. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
morally, you can't sleep at night, but shiny magic item, says Redza.
Yeah, it's interesting that they call it a dark urge, and it's. I'm a communications major, so I love tearing things apart, and it's like, do we call mental illness dark? What does that mean? But it is good
Right.
that your friends are going to save you, right? Like, that's a good thing for sure. But it's,
Yeah.
it's always interesting when you start to like poke at these things and
It,
you're like, what does that
Yeah.
say about this?
it's it's super interesting too, because in the context of that, and what Leona mentioned before, like, right, there's a huge component whenever we play a video game, particularly one like this, that gives you the choice of the concept of, and Leona touched on a little bit of ludocognitive dissonance, right? The difference between, you're doing this because you're in a game, right? You're in a game, right? And your answers, like you said, would change in the real world, right? And you're in some cases, you're not necessarily doing that evil thing because you want to do the evil thing. You're doing it because you want that shiny item, right? You're doing it because it's going to lead to a particular outcome that you want, not because you're playing to play evil, right? Because there are certain weapons and armors and things like that you can only get if you make that evil choice, right? Um, and so there's this kind of interesting disconnect, and there's people, if you haven't heard the term, you can read all kinds of articles about ludocognitive dissonance on the internet, um, where because we're playing a video game, we're making choices in that context, and that also can kind of translate into um, into tabletop role playing games. But the real key caveat there is that it doesn't mean that it doesn't have real world impact, and it doesn't mean that it can't influence real world choices and decisions and the way you see things either.
That's correct. It also kind of like brings back the tiefling and goblin camps, the parallels. They're both bustling market squares. You can buy things, you can interact with the NPCs there, but the tieflings are like the nice people. You're supposed to save them. You need to, work with the druids to save them. And then the goblins are kind of, oh, boo, they're the invaders. We get to kill them. We have one of them imprisoned in the tiefling camp as of Act 1.
Yep.
And it's very interesting to see that Laren actually set it up in such a way that they're both essentially the same thing. They both have similar shops. They both have similar NPCs you can interact with, except one of these groups are evil and so justifies killing, where they have a beloved relative to the narrative NPC that's imprisoned in the goblin camp, and he's made to perform for them. I know we're all smiling.
Right.
We don't like Volo. All of us don't like Volo. It's okay. We can admit that we all don't like Volo here. There's an anti-Volo safe space.
I kept Vola around long enough to get the eye from him, and that was it.
Yeah.
I briefly went into a deep dive on ludocognitive dissonance because I'm so glad to know that a term exists for it. But the other thing that I want to point out, speaking of real world equivalencies that we haven't necessarily touched on just yet, but the notion of tieflings as an equivalency to queerness. There's the love of tieflings among the queer community, like so many queer folk. Like, why are tieflings as a race in D&D so damn popular? And it's because a lot of folk identify with that kind of lived experience of what the tiefling represents, as this person who is seen as different, is seen as other, and treated differently because of their queerness. And so because of that, tieflings do inherently come with this, although it may not be like part of the actual game, but when you start to really think about it, like, tieflings are kind of your queer analog, right? They're kind of your queer equivalent. And so what does it mean when you could potentially kill off the entire queer community in your game? you know, and that's just another like part of that puzzle that you got to that you think about.
There's a key a companion character who's a drow, a female drow, and the only way you can get her as a companion is by taking that evil route and attacking the Druid Grove, right? And that's the only way to get her as a companion. Now, granted, again, if you do that, there are consequences. There are two of the characters that you have right from the beginning who flat up, and maybe more, but there are two for sure. If you take the drow on as a companion, who leave the party, they're done. They will not stick around. And one of them is Karlak, I'm pretty sure, and the other one is Will. They will not stick around with the party if you take on the drow. Now there have been a lot of players who have asked for a toned down version of that companion character, who you don't have to take the evil route in order to be able to recruit her to the party. But I do think that it is significant that again, they put those real consequences in there, that you're going to lose at least two companions, if not more, if you choose to take that route.
And it's interesting because it's Will and Karlak who are known to have conflict with each other, even from the get-go. When you speak to Will, he is open in saying that he wants to deal with the Fury of Everness, which you find out later is Karlak, who is pretty cool. And you have an actual scene, if you recruit her, where they actually argue in your camp about what happened and how they got here in the first place. I did end up like reading up about her because I really wanted to know where she was. So when I read about her, I actually found out about the confrontation in camp. So it's actually very interesting that if you recruit this particular character, that they both leave because they had conflict with each other.
Yeah.
And even they take a stand and they're like, we're aligned in this particular thing.
Yeah.
This is not okay. We are going to set aside our differences and say that this is the common enemy and we are not okay with this. That's actually something worth noting with the NPC dynamic. I find that very well done on Larian's part. Like every NPC has their own conflict, their own interests, and even if their interests don't completely align, sometimes they converge. So even people like Lae'zel and Shadowheart, they bicker all the time. Shadowheart is like high-key racist to Lae'zel pretty often.
Yeah.
Yes.
But even in some instances, they will align. Like if you make fun of the goblins and throw shit in their faces, they both align and they will both approve, even if Shadowheart usually doesn't approve of violence.
Yeah. I will say that I also give Lyrian credit. Certainly, you can always do better, right? But they do a fairly good job for a computer role-playing game of demonstrating. Lae'zel and Shadowheart are two, and Will and Karlak. They do a fairly good job of demonstrating that those characters working together, being in a party together, and things like that, they actually come to respect each other or become friends, depending on choices that are made in the game, and put aside differences that they have in the early game. And I think they do a fairly decent job. Certainly there are points of improvement you could point to. They do a fairly decent job of demonstrating the way contact and getting to know someone and understanding someone and working with someone helps to shed racist ideas that someone may come into a relationship with.
Oh yeah.
Or even preconceptions. Like the
Yes.
whole will and Khaled thing was like a massive misunderstanding. So
Hmm.
it's a lot of preconceptions that come in and they eventually get dispelled. They do this very well as well in Divinity Original Sin 2. So props to Lyrian for keeping that particular set of ideas going forward into Baldur's
Hmm.
Gate. So that's something that I would give Larian a lot of props for as well.
Yes.
Just because
Agreed.
it's been a very common theme for them, even in other games that are not in the D&D IP.
Hmm.
There's one thing I'm interested in, the concept of layering games, creating this game at the time that it has. And that since 4E, which y'all said is when Faerun started, Forgotten Realms started, since 4E, 5E, there's been a few changes to the way that race and racial benefits are perceived in D&D. So with Tasha's, I was just reading the apology that Watsy did, Wizards of the Coast did, saying like, yeah, it was our bad. Racial benefits and deficits shouldn't have been there. Oops. It's going to be fixed in Tasha's, what you can buy for $50 or whatever.
Right.
So it's curious that Larian had this world this whole time, and they weren't really on the ball with the changes that were involved in this world creation. The idea that, excuse me, the idea that like there's no evil races, there's no one born evil, there's no one culture that is perfect, that is all evil or all good. So it's curious that, again, when we're presented with this world that's like, oh, here's these people, and they're all one way, except for that
Yeah.
special one that you run across.
So it's super important, I think, to note that the original Forgotten Realms box set came out in 1987, which was 2 years before second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came out. And so it was like at the tail end of the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, back when D&D was split into basic D&D and advanced D&D. And they kind of premiered it as this flagship thing, and it's been around ever since, right? And then in fourth edition, it is when they really kind of, somewhat in third edition a little bit, they kind of bounced around the worlds, but in fourth edition is when they kind of decided to make it the default, and then definitely with fifth edition, to make it the default setting for D&D, as opposed to what they had used previously in the past, which had been like them rotating through the various D&D worlds, and previously. And so, it's an older setting, one of the older settings for D&D, and it coincides thereafter in the 90s. That is when they started doing Spelljammer and all that other stuff, late 80s, early 90s, and Dark Sun and all these other settings that they started throwing out at the time, which also both have their issues with racism. And so it's super important, I think, to know that as few POC faces as there are in gaming spheres now, there were far fewer then. And so this was completely, almost totally, at the time Forgotten Realms came out, not only a white endeavor, but an almost exclusively male endeavor. There were a handful of women who were some very key contributors to early D&D, and it's like first 10 years or so, 10, 15 years or so. But women didn't really heavily start getting into the hobby until actually Vampire the Masquerade came out with the storyteller system in 91. And so it's almost all middle-class white men when the Forgotten Realms comes out. And that particularly kind of frames the kind of world they were building. It's like we talked about, extraordinarily Eurocentric, and the places that aren't Europe, Al-Qadim, which is their Middle East roughly equivalent, Khartoum, which is their Asia equivalent, and Mastika, which is their Mesoamerican equivalent, are all framed, when you look at like the advertisements for when they came out, they're all framed as these exotic, mysterious other places for people from the Sword Coast, from the central part of the Forgotten Realms, or from the Inner Sea region, to go out, or around the Sea of Stars rather, to go out and explore these like mysterious places. And you could certainly play as someone from those places, but they're still kind of presented in this framing as the other places.
I need to go back and watch Asian Represents podcast. They did an amazing criticism on Karator, which inspired this show.
Karator is terrible.
It's so good.
It's
so good.
As an East Asian, it's so terrible, descending.
Yeah, the Asians Represent thing is so good on that. So good.
It's so good. I will also add on the note of like, oh well, Tasha's came out, and why didn't Baldur's Gate 3 kind of roll with that? It looks like just a very brief Google search is telling me that like a small team first started working on the story and game design in late 2016 for Baldur's Gate 3. Video game production takes a long time, especially for a video game of size and scope. And Tasha's came out in 2020. It's just not enough time, I think, for them, in their defense, to like pivot and like adjust like that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I as someone who's kind of like seen video game production and timelines, like it's kind of a hard sell. So that may be part of why we don't see it in this version. I would hope that if a Baldur's Gate 4 happens, that they would adopt some of the changes from Tasha. The other potential kind of reason why the Tasha thing may not have transferred over is also because these types of IPs, like it falls under IP law, right? Like Tasha's is a newer product, and Larian may not have had the rights to like pull directly from that, right? For example, we talk about D&D, we talk about the SRD, right? Which is like the version of D&D that everybody has access to, right? That you can kind of pull from and do whatever with. And this kind of can be a similar situation potentially, where they don't have access to things like Tasha's, like especially if it comes on, like if they started 2016, 2017 and Tasha's came out in 2020 and it's 2023, like it's right in the middle of the development process. Like it's just like those types of things would take too long for them to get the IP and then try to pivot and so on and so forth. And so what video game studios sometimes have to make those ugly decisions. And so that can affect timing. It definitely can affect timing, because it's like we are having these conversations online faster and faster and almost in a cyclical ad nauseum fashion. But these projects have been in work from 2016. And so they come out with those 2016 values and beliefs, because it's hard to do that. And it sounds like, for what it's worth, like they've done a good job of like trying to unpack some of this stuff along the way. But yeah, it's definitely like, again, it's room for improvement, it's room for growth, and hopefully by the time they get to do the next one, that they can start to adjust that and shift that, right? Like that's kind of how that process works. So not necessarily a defense, but like something to just kind of like keep in mind when we talk about these things.
Absolutely.
I think what
let me interject.
Go ahead.
If I may. And I'll say, has Larian come out since and said that? Have they come out and said, we were working off Jim Crow law, so we made this game?
Right.
I don't think it would, because Watsy will probably have their hits. But but I think it kind of pivots into what Panda Cabra said about relating to goblins. Now that Tasha's has been put on the table, I'd like to also talk about how they changed the Hobgoblin lore.
Go off. I will just add before you go off, because I want you to go off, that the late 2016 date that I pulled was from the general information page on Larian Studios. So that was like something that they themselves have said is we started in 2016. Just to make sure just to back up my facts. Okay, please go.
So the hobgoblins historically, like throughout Faerun lore, have been a warmongering race. So they're very militaristic. They are highly skilled mercenaries. They are mercenary race. Like they are not inherently evil. They are just extremely mercenary. And then Watsy said, "Well, that's terrible. We don't want to show that." And then they changed the hobgoblins to be whimsical, fey-born bards. And they did the same thing to goblins and bugbears, but to a lesser extent. The goblins and the bugbears keep most of their aspects, just that they what was perceived to be, sneaky and terrible were changed to, oh, these are good things. It's necessary to survive in the Feywild, but the hobgoblins' character development gets completely assassinated. And it's very odd of a decision for Watsy to do, considering they have a lot of other evil races that they have not addressed or talked about, as Stefan was talking about the Drow. They will not address the Githyanki, the Githzerai. They are not addressed. It's the hobgoblins that get the brunt of this situation for some very bizarre reason. And the hobgoblins, as mentioned, they're not depicted as evil most of the time. They are mercenary. They just take whichever side is convenient. If you look at it closely, their outlook is more neutral than anything. But their entire lore gets removed and changed, as of Tasha's. And it's a very bizarre decision that I still have no idea why they did this. And as Panda Cabra said, goblins always seem like they have no free will, they have no decisions, and they're often depicted as stereotypically big-nosed, which again is another thing to unpack. And yet, Watsy thought it was okay to keep all of that in and just be like, yeah, their sneakiness is a good thing. This, the fact that they can escape really well is a good thing. The fact that they take orders really well is a good thing. So that's something that I think is also worth addressing within the context of Baldur's Gate 3, where we see this mob of goblins that are fanatically obsessed, almost cult-like, with their leaders, multiple leaders, in fact. They're not just taking orders, they are obsessed with the leadership and command.
Yeah.
So that's something that you see throughout the Goblin camp when you talk to anybody. Yeah. They're like, the Absolute is amazing. We love the Absolute. We have no idea who the Absolute is, but we love the Absolute. Like, it's just an abstract concept to them that they just cling on to. And it's like almost tribalistic, and it's very infantilizing. That's the way I perceive it.
I think you're right. Well, they only respond to power, right? They only respond to strength. As soon as you can show you're a little bit stronger or really just have a higher status than they do, then they all kowtow.
And they're the other angle of that kind of bioessentialist thing in the goblins, at least thus far as I've encountered in the game. And like I said, I have 2 characters well in the 3rd act. There are no good goblins. They're all like evil. They are all like conform to exactly everything that everyone here just said. And so there are no exceptions. They are completely an archetype of, well, here's this race, and they're just all like that. End of story.
I think there's a couple telling parts in the Goblin camp. One of them is when you kind of circle back around the backside of the camp, and there's these 2 or 3 Goblin kids who don't have names. They're just numbered in order of kid. And they're like kicking the shit out of a dead body. And they're like, you can confront them and engage them in different ways. But the way I engaged them was, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, this dude killed my dad or my parents or whatever. It's like, oh, okay. Are you mad? Like, no, fuck my parents. I didn't like my parents anyway. And now I'm the best or whatever. It's just like, so are you saying that they're born that way? Are you saying that they're trying to, like, what is the game trying to communicate in that scene? It's very curious.
I think Red Zeph also brings up a very good point that goblins are survivors. So somebody that embraces them for who they are pretty much tips the scale of them following them to the ends of the world, and with the obsessive like cult-like worship, because to them it's like the first time probably that somebody actually acknowledges them. Never mind that this person is using them. And again, it kind of plays into another stereotype of that they're too stupid to realize that this person is actively using them, or if they're not, they are willing to become pawns just so that they can gain more power. Which again, it's another thing that's like so much to unpack in one sentence. This is the second time I'm saying this, and if I had a nickel for every time I say this, I have 2 nickels, which is much, but it's terrible that it's happened twice.
There's a lot to unpack in this game. Like, you are not wrong. It is a very correct statement to use.
It's
Let's
an
throw away
interesting
the entire suitcase.
It's an interesting concept, though. I mean, the goblins are survivors of what? Who knows what? It's not part of the story. But then someone approaches them and says, I see you for what you are. You're killers and murderers and raiders and thieves. And if you follow me, you can do more of that shit. And it's horrible to witness, but there's parallels to
real world parallels. Absolutely, there are. You know, you how many times I think have there been discussions about if you treat a certain group of people a particular way, they're not going to see any other option but then to act that way, right? Like, because you don't give them any other option, right? And I think it very much says that. And I think, like, one of the things with this game is it's a complex game, and they put a lot of complexities into the game that unfortunately, I think some people who criticize POC, who are trying to point some of the issues out, they don't see the complexity that's there, and they try and paint everything in terms of this or that, because there are some amazing things going on in this game alongside some of the things that I think we need to have conversations about, just like we're doing now. There are some praiseworthy things happening, some awful things happening, and everything in between. And that complexity contributes that in both directions, right? In many, many ways. And it's not something that I think you can just easily break down, just like in real world comparisons, easily break down into, oh, well, you just hate D&D and you just hate, I mean, I got 3 characters that got over 150 hours in this darn game, for crying out loud. I'm having a ton of fun, warts and all, right?
Yeah, it's very like black and white to these people, and it's just kind of like, I've ran for convention level D&D games for the past 6 years. What do you mean I hate D&D? Like, this is not a conversation about you or for you.
Right.
We like the game, so we criticize it because we want them to do better. And
exactly.
This kind of pivots into what Redza said. On the flip side, how do you negotiate or work with someone who, by default, once you did, it's a tough nut to crack.
It's ugly, right? It makes me think of in early US, and this happened everywhere. But the US government was like, hey, you native tribe, you hate this tribe, we'll help you take out this tribe, wipe them all out, and then when we're done with that, we'll kill you too. But it's the same kind of thing. Yeah. It's like, I'm gonna use I can't remember the tribe woman's name, but she's saying that essentially. She's like, I'm gonna use you until you're all used up, and I have exactly what I want. I don't care.
Yep.
You're really nothing to me. I do not see you as equal, or I don't want to say see you as human. What's the parallel though? I do not see you on my level. You know, it's complex, right?
It's the divide and conquer strategy, right? And America learned it from the British and the French, and learned it quite well. That strategy that you and you see some of that play out, and I certainly give. Here's the thing, I think at some level, some of these things that are problematic, not all of them, but some of the things that are problematic in Baldur's Gate 3 are leery and say, hey people, we need to grapple with these things, right? We need to grapple with some of these problematic elements. Again, part of the problem is that you have a large segment and a loud segment that isn't doing any grappling, right? They're just doing, what are you brown people complaining about shut your mouths, just play the game,
Just
right?
play the game.
Mhm.
Just be happy
But I
with what
think
you
there
have.
are,
Have you ever heard that before?
yeah, exactly. And I think in some places, I can see that. I think Lyrian is asking us to grapple with these things and consider how they might have some impact beyond the game, right?
Which is great.
Which is spectacular. But unfortunately, yeah, we have to contend with those people who aren't seeing that component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's, I think it's very important when we talk about these things and we have these discussions, the fact that some people actively feel discomfort when, as POC when they play this game. And that's, super valid and super real. And like, those are important discussions to be had. And it's, it is unfortunate when people kind of push back. It's like, oh, you hate D&D. No. We're just trying to have a conversation here, right? Like we're these are the spaces for these conversations, these are these spaces to do these things. That does not mean we inherently hate, but it does mean that we can point out the things that are painful, and POC are allowed to kind of ask for space to not feel that discomfort while also educating others and showing others and, others needing to do that work to think and learn and understand, and both of these things can exist and be true at the same time, and people don't ever want to stop to think about those moments and those nuances and all of that stuff. They just want one simple one size fits all answer, and that ain't how it works.
Yeah, if I hated it, I wouldn't care this much.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Like
we would not demand that it would be better. We won't demand accountability if we didn't like this game so much. Like, why do you think I spent 6 years running this? It's like, I have the books. I have a D&D Beyond subscription with all the books available. What do you think I'm saying when I ask Baldur's Gate 3 to do better in certain aspects instead of advocating genocide for one? It's just it's just pretty bad. Like the whole Act 1 is pretty much just you have two options. If you're not stealthy enough, you have to kill everyone in the goblin camp. And you're like, that's a lot of resources mechanically. And morally, do I want this? Like, it's presented as the good path, the best path, the path of least resistance.
Yes.
But it's actually the path of most resistance because you're using so much resources to go through every single goblin. But I mean, if we're looking at it from like a purely mechanical perspective, it's completely unviable, even if you're playing this as if it was regular D&D.
Yeah.
But the other option is to assassinate key leaders.
It does raise a question. I was going to say it does raise a question about like D&D when like Leona mentioned before, these things being baked into D&D. So like, for instance, later on in the game in the second act, there are at least 2 instances that I've encountered and used where you can get bosses that you would otherwise have to fight to eliminate themselves. Or to have their or no 3, maybe 4. Yeah, there's a few. Anyway, there's a few bosses where you can completely avoid the boss fight by either getting them to kill their minions and then themselves, or getting their minions to kill them.
Wow!
You get just as much experience as if you had the fight, right? You can still acquire like all the choice goodies in the loot, but the huge caveat there is that when we talk about like certain things being baked into D&D, it's an interesting thing to raise, because you're still effectively eliminating them. You're just having them kill themselves or their minions kill them, right? Yeah. It's still about the violent outcome, right? It's not about you being able to talk to them and say, hey, maybe you might be better on a different path, right? Or something like that, right? And so I think that goes back to that kind of at least one example of something being kind of baked into D&D, right? And that's this particular element of this is how you resolve these things. It's not by like having a conversation with someone and saying, hey, maybe you could join me, or maybe you could take a different path. And I think that's what some people are asking for with like the drow NPC that you could only recruit if you take the route. Can we have a path where we can like have a redemption arc for that character, right? But your choices here are like, again, with these bosses that I'm thinking about in the second act are, it's going to end in a particular form of violence. It's just you're getting them. You have the speech skills and the persuasion or deception skills enough to get them to eliminate themselves. But it's still a violent outcome either way.
And that speaks to, again, D&D itself, like D&D mechanics. 5e has done a lot to try to break away from this, to try.
Yes.
Not successfully, I feel like. But the D&D at its core is a game about violence. There is no other real way. Like, a lot of GMs will adjust and tweak it so that roleplay can do things. But when you look at the base game, the history of the game and the base game and what is baked into it, you win for being in violence. You win for being in battle. You are actively, that is the prize. That is the thing you need to do. Otherwise, you don't get the things you want, right? Like I said, a lot of GMs will tweak that and adjust that because that's not necessarily what they want to do. But at that point, are you really playing D&D? Is kind of my little cheeky argument there.
Right.
But D&D actively incentivizes you. That's the word I was looking for. Incentivizes you to pick violence in some form. And that is built in. You cannot remove that. And that shows up in Baldur's Gate 3, and it shows up at D&D tables all the time too. And it's like, oh, they went murder hobo. Well, yeah, because they get the most stuff that way.
Right.
And it's because it is so incentivized. It goes back to this thing of like, you have to do violence. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, and a lot to kind of be thought about when it comes to the fact that you have to do violence in order to achieve things. You literally had, like you said, there was persuasion there. There were other options there, but the option that ends in is still death, rather than persuading them to drop it, walk away, whatever, and like I know of tables where like, a persuasion roll would turn into a role play scene rather than a fight scene, but this will always end in death and violence. And it's just a very D&D issue.
It is. Absolutely. 100%. And like with all the choice, I think it would have been spectacular if there had been some of those options that let you do persuasion that didn't end in death. And I know there are a couple that allow you to not do that, but like I'm thinking of some very key. These are like some fairly tough boss battles if you were to try and take the combat route, where really what you're doing is you're like saving yourself the quote unquote legwork of having to fight that battle yourself. I mean, you're still getting the loot for it, which is an interesting option, right? But it would have been nice to have seen. But it goes back to, they did that because that felt more D&D than being able to talk someone into walking away or coming to your side or any of those other options.
Yep. It speaks to video games, right? We put in a thing that allows you, as like speaking about video games in a very meta sense of like, oh, we put in a thing to save you to have to grind through that fight. Like, here's your easy win for the fight. But it goes back to this assumption of like, oh, this is a video game where you're supposed to fight. I'm very intrigued by Starfield having this very interesting persuasion mechanic, and like, what would happen if you had that type of option in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where the end result did not end in violence and death? Like, what, and like, I encourage anyone who is listening to this to start thinking about things like that and how that can really shift a game, and like consider how adding those mechanics, because at the, as you kind of said, my ADHD is struggling to remember exactly what you said, but I think I'm adding to what you're saying. Hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I think I kind of like see where you're going, but D&D's like violence is baked into the narrative, and at some point it's kind of like you can build a pacifistic character, but if everyone else is optimized and they want to go the violent route, you're still gonna lose, and at some point it's better to just play another game. Because there was a table that I was in that was kind of in that situation where someone anti-optimized himself to only be social, and he would force every encounter to be a social encounter no matter what the situation was, and eventually got very frustrating because people were very unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of leads into a situation where expectations are important when it comes to tabletop RPGs. We come into video
Yeah.
games like this because we have expectations that it's gonna be violent. We have to commit crimes. We have to
Yes.
we have
Yes.
to we have to kill people. Like we
Mm-hmm.
have that
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
expectation. It's very
Correct.
different from like a table where it's face to face. You can communicate with these people and say, hey, I'm not a fan of this. I'm going to leave this table because I'm not a fan of how you play. No hard feelings. We can't really disengage from a video game like the same way because we're like,
Mm.
we don't like this. We are closing the game forever. Like we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
like the
Yep.
game enough to engage with it, but that's kind of where we are right now in terms of like critiquing the choices that the game is making for us, because most of the time you don't have to resort to these things. Like with the goblins, you can scare them off using the tadpole. Even though it's like a rechargeable thing, you can actually scare them off without having to resort to killing them. They respond to that and they leave you alone in a lot of instances. I cleared out the entire blighted village without dropping a single drop of blood because I was using the tadpole ability to just scare most of them off. And it
Mm-hmm.
might bite me in the butt later because they go back to their camp, but at the very least, I averted a crisis and used the least resources to get there.
Yeah.
Mm. Which is something that I think is great that Larian actually kind of pseudo
Yeah.
encourages it,
Hmm.
because or else you end up in a situation where it's like wave after wave after wave of fighting when you have this option of just being like, hey, I'm telling you to go away with my mental powers. Please
Yeah.
go away. And then
Yeah.
they
It's
just
a,
do.
it's an
Yeah.
interesting dichotomy that they set up there, because you can definitely do that, but the more you use the tadpole, the more it has an impact on your character, and the more it will change your character. And eventually, when you get to powers, as you unlock more powers, it has more, not only on your physical appearance, but on other aspects of your character. Um, and then it sets up some interesting kind of dichotomies. So it's like, are you willing to essentially um, take on these powers, um, and have these things happen to you in order to be able to do these things where, like, maybe you can scare people off, you don't have to fight as much and things like that, but then there's going to be like consequences on your end. And then you can also choose to try and encourage your companions, because pretty much all of your companions are against,
Mm.
except for a couple of them are like, we should use this. A lot of them are against using the tadpoles, but you can convince them, hey, no, you need to start taking on some of these powers too. And then that raises a bunch of interesting questions to, like, when they're initially like, hey, no, I don't want anything to do that. And you're like, no, look, listen, let me persuade you, right?
That's one of the problems I had in the later acts, which is the dialogue choices around the tadpoles. We obviously do, I guess, depending on your choices, your personal belief. For me, as I play, I don't want the tadpole in me. That was put in me against my consent. I want to find the cure.
Yep.
That's my story.
I wanna
and then
just like
Same.
eh,
and
you
then
know?
as the story continues and more events progress without spoiling, the options for each character dialogue become: do you want to love the tadpole? Do you want to like the tadpole? Leave. and so like the game's pushing you to, like, tell your friends to do more shit, to put more tadpoles in their ears and whatever. It's off-putting because I don't even want the tadpole in me. What
Right.
is the game trying to get me to do? It's
Yeah,
weird.
and like my moniker is tadpole. I have 50 tadpoles in a trench coat, and I don't want the tadpole in me. Like it was put into me against my will. Like I
Right.
don't I
Yeah.
don't consent. I don't consent to this thing, and like you mentioned, as the game progresses, they actually actively encourage you. Like even the first time you meet someone who has the tadpole, the guy that asks you to mercy kill him, it encourages you to take the tadpole because it's actually the easier one to pass compared to resisting the tadpole's influence, which is
Yeah.
actually a relatively high check for a character of your level at that period of time.
Yeah.
Which
Yep.
is wild.
Yeah, it's very messed up.
Yeah,
That's wild.
almost all of the checks when you choose to use the tadpole's abilities. In my experience, if you do choose to use the tadpole abilities, almost all of the checks I've encountered have been like a DC 5 to 7 or less.
Mm.
It's really is kind of steering you towards wanting to use the ability. And I fooled around with it a little bit just to see. Like I said, oh, I'm going to try. Like on one of my characters, I was like, oh, I just want to see. So I like did the tadpole, and I'm like, I wanted to see the power tree come up, the new power tree that comes up, and all this other stuff, because you're given an opportunity to unlock like a wider range of more powerful abilities later on, and I just wanted to see what it looked like. But I did it for a little bit, wanted to see the powers, and I was like, yeah, okay, no. And then I went back to my other save, and I was like, that's not for me. So thus far, both of my playthroughs, I haven't used gone down the power tree that unlocks or anything like that. And whenever I've had conversations with my companions, it's been, I'd never taken the option to especially even if I did, I've been like, okay, I might do it myself, but I'm not going to force them into doing it. Right. No, that just feels smarmy.
Yeah, and in that vein, I very much sympathize with Lae'zel, who is of a cult. Like again, as mentioned, she's raised in like a cult-like manner to hate these things, and she has one of them in her, and there's like an internal struggle of just like, I need to get this out as soon as possible. I am unclean. Like she mentions this on several occasions. She thinks that she's default, and she needs to get this out as quickly as possible. She uses that term. Like she actively fights against it and tells you that she is tainted by this tadpole.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way, that I'm tainted by this tadpole. I do not want this here, and I am tadpole. Like this is okay. Like I said, it needs to have guidelines and terms and conditions. This tadpole needs to sign a binding contract with me before I go into
right.
There needs to be a session 0 before you play Baldur's Gate. Is what
right?
missing.
Yeah.
You say that, but low key. Like, you joking, but low key, actually, because Retsa, who is in chat, is a dear friend of mine, and one of the commentaries that she made to me was that Baldur's Gate 3 is an amazing game, but it's not a good introduction to D&D, especially for players who are not familiar with min-maxing. You have to have like the idea of optimized builds, which when you're on a D&D table, you don't necessarily need to have, but Baldur's Gate 3 follows a very specific D&D formula where if you are not optimized, you are not going to succeed. And she was telling me about one of her friends who was kind of running into some trouble playing Baldur's Gate 3 for that exact reason. And it's like, the idea of almost session zeroing with a game like this is not inherently a bad idea, because there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot to learn. Are you even going to be cool with those mechanics? Do you really want to min-max, knowing that if you don't, you're going to struggle even more with the game, which is a very classic D&D thing, and I won't get into that, but there's all these things to kind of consider.
Well, and I think the tadpole thing is a key thing, because certainly I've run games myself, and I've run and I've been in games where there's been sort of this, of course, the tadpole initially is a mechanism to bring the party members together, if you will. Like if you were playing a tabletop game, it's like you're all going to have this particular affliction that you need to solve, and that's what's going to keep you together while your characters get to know each other, right? Before you form those bonds, right? However, now certainly I'm an old gamer, so I was around long before we had safety tools, and we would do things, without consent and things like that, because the concept hadn't even been introduced in when I first started playing. But since the advent of safety tools, that's the kind of thing that you would have a session zero conversation about. Like, hey, I want to use this plot mechanism that's going to bring the party together. Here are a little bit of the details, right, about that plot mechanism. I don't want to give too much away, but I can tell you these things. And how does everybody feel about that, right? And obviously, that's a component you're not getting with like Baldur's Gate 3 and this tadpole kind of being rammed into your eye, right? And it would almost be like, certainly they can't do like a full session zero with everybody, but like you make these choices down the road, and it would certainly be interesting to see if the game would be any different if they said at the beginning, hey, there's this tadpole thing. Here's this mechanism. We're not going to give you too much detail, but you're going to have a tadpole in your eye, and it's going to be part of the main storyline. Do you want to take that route or the route without, right? It would complicate things, because then you'd have to come up with some other conceit about why these characters are working together and all that other stuff. But, you know, I think that one thing Lyrian has done with Baldur's Gate 3 is that they've certainly demonstrated that there is the ability to incorporate a lot of impactful choice into these types of games. And they've done that really, really well in a lot of ways. And so I certainly think it's a possibility to at least consider for game devs about being able to take that kind of a road and say, hey, do you want to play with this particular mechanism, or do you want to set that aside?
Or even just content warnings. Like this is something that I work on with game devs all the time, is like, even if you just have good concrete content warnings, like that can do a lot for people. You know,
Yes.
like these topics are important and they need to be talked about, but giving people a heads up of what they're getting into. I remember the controversy around Boyfriend Dungeon, because what people's perception of Boyfriend Dungeon was going to be, and then what it came out to be with a plot line that involved a stalker, was not what everyone expected. And so having you know, the safety tools can be incorporated into video games, and that's I think a big thing that I want to drive home, is that you can actually include session zero mechanics and safety tools and content warnings and things like that make for enjoyable gameplay for more people, and there are easy ways to do that. And it's about, if you are a video game dev watching this, like it is about, you know, and or a studio watching this, like it's about your values, you know, and what you value as creators.
And it's not even just the content warning for like the tadpole being put into you against your will. I had a friend who was very squeaked out by the eye trauma alone. So that's also that's something that's also worth keeping in mind, that people actually do have like need these types of content warnings, not even just for like I consent / I don't consent. It's just like the basic idea of the body horror that also needs to be flagged in the first place, because they did have a flag for like nudity. So it's very possible that they could just have a flag for the eye trauma that is in the opening scene alone. So that's something worth thinking about as well.
I'm imagining my head.
It's very doable,
AI.
and these things are. Oh no, that's all. Go ahead.
Well, sorry, I missed what you said completely. My apologies.
Oh no, it's all good. It's gone. It's all good. It was not super important. It's all good. ADHD just went, okay, it's all good. Please.
The train just like disembarked from the station.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Train of thought derailed. Innocent joke killed. Film at 11.
Pretty much.
It's all good. No, it's all good. It happens, right?
Yeah,
I think the one thing that I was gonna say is like, there's a tadpole, there's eye trauma, there's all of these things, and it's like, you know, it's almost like people start to expect that of D&D. It's like, oh yeah, of course there's this in there. It's D&D, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can, in fact, reimagine D&D. And I think that's the summation of whatever train I was on. That's the caboose of it.
Absolutely.
And also, like the house flipper thing with the content warning and options. I really liked that one because it does allow you to switch the cockroaches that are in the house into glass shards, but the mechanic to get rid of them, to clean the place, is the same. You just use a vacuum cleaner and you vacuum it up. So that's a wonderful thing for accessibility for something that House Flipper has gotten to. So if
Yes.
Larian was able to have a content warning for nudity, they could also have had something similar when it comes to the installation of the tadpole to at least skip the part
Yes.
where it happens. Like
Mhm.
it doesn't need to be like the eye specifically, you know, if we really want to go down that route and assuming that, you know, we're all okay with this. It it's a lot of things, and I know it's kind of a afterthought kind of situation, but it's a bit odd that you have something for a content warning for nudity, but you don't have a content warning for eye trauma, you know?
Yeah.
Right. Right.
That's what I was thinking a minute ago, which is I'm imagining Watsy or somebody now is developing an AI DM, and you insert all of you basically send in that same sheet you send in for every game that you play in, and the AI reads it and spits out a game or even a video game like Baldur's Gate, just detailed for you.
I mean
It's kind of icky, but it's
that
like it saved a lot of
I mean
problems.
that may very well be like what we might end up seeing about some of the stuff they're doing with their VR VTT that they're working on. It may not be very far from that.
Yeah.
And I think my friend actually tried it. He did kind of try to generate something out of it. He said at some point it just kind of ends up in a death loop where the AI has no idea what you're asking for, so it just keeps repeating the same
Oh
option
God.
over and over again.
Mhm.
But it was about, I think, 6 months ago, so who knows what has happened
Oh my
at this
gosh.
point. But
Yeah.
but it is a thing, and he tried it. He said he wasn't very impressed. He's an older DM that has done a whole bunch of tabletop RPGs, and he said he wasn't very impressed with what the AI was coming up with. It's a nice tool, but to him it was just kind of like, I
Yeah.
can just homebrew my own thing.
Oh yeah. It does not do very well with trying to do, if you ask it to try and do like a TTRPG storylines, the current iteration of AIs do not do well at all. Not
Well, yeah.
well at all.
Give them a year.
It's actually
Give 'em 2.
hilarious, but
Give 'em
they're gonna
5.
but yeah, that's exactly it. They're gonna refine it. It's gonna get there, but yeah.
All right. On that solid note, we're gonna take a little break, mostly so I can run these break ads. Hello, everyone. Yes. No. Are we in there?
Well,
Yes.
are we in there? Chat?
There we
we're
go.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
It's just that I don't trust technology to do the things that I want it to do when I say to do it. That's the issue. So I hit a button and I'm like, "You're gonna do that thing, right?" And the computer's like, "I don't know. I don't feel like it."
Meh.
Anyway,
I guess.
welcome back
That's
to
me with my
nOne-shot.
laptop right now.
This has been
My laptop's
such
on the
a
floor.
really good conversation about Baldur's Gate, role-playing games, D&D in general. I really appreciate our panelists. I wanted to pose a question to my panelists again regarding the impact of playing games like Baldur's Gate 3. So we did talk about safety tools and the idea of wanting maybe a safety tool or session 0 before we play Baldur's Gate. So I'm like, I kind of want to opt out of certain things here. Same kind of thing for being a person of color while playing this game. There's certain aspects of the game where you're like, wow, you know, if I had the choice, I would opt out. I would X-card this scene of slavery or grotesque murder, etc. But that's what I'm curious for y'all, if you have any opinions on just the impact of seeing some of these parallels in this game while you're going through it or just experiencing it. So I'm just curious.
Parallels, like how so, in a game context or
Yeah.
a real life context? I think
Or
The kind of intersection.
yeah.
okay. I'm like I've mentioned, I've been DMing for a while, but I think that something that I neglect to leave out is that I actually do public play. So what happens is that I'm usually a GM for strangers, like groups of strangers, instead of a set group of people that come in all the time. And I think the biggest takeaway is that everyone's expectations are different. I didn't really have a lot of thought about how Baldur's Gate 3 executed a lot of things, but I was just kind of like, I can see where this is coming from, but it doesn't make me any less uncomfortable. And it also kind of comes across in a lot of games that I GM as a whole, because things that I do as a GM, some people like it, some people just don't like it, some people are like, oh, we just won't say anything until we leave because it's not polite to tell the GM that you didn't enjoy their game, or something along those lines. Even if I prompt them to be like, hey, how did you enjoy this game? Like, especially when it comes to conventions, because we kind of need the feedback. They'll be like, no, we loved it. And then I find out afterwards that they didn't like it, which I think that is not something we should do when it comes to Larian, as a company as big as they are, and with the representation that they've put in. We should be allowed to skip past certain scenes that we don't like because it's our experience. We're playing this by ourselves. There's only one person that can curate their own experiences, and it's us. We should be given those tools to be like, no, we don't want to engage in this manner. Give us another option.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give us that option for a lot of things. Like, not even, like, as mentioned, like, the violence is baked in. Can't do much about that. The racism is baked in. But there should be allowance and space for us
Yeah.
to say we are allowed to walk away from this situation. In fact, there are a lot of scenes that when you engage in it, you're not even allowed to escape or leave the combat because you're just forced into it. The first thing that comes to mind is the bugbear sex scene, where you go in and you're like, the first instinct is like, oh no, I'm so sorry, but you're forced into combat immediately. You can't leave, you can't escape.
Yeah.
It's one of the combats that you cannot leave by just walking away. They force you into it and they close the door on you.
Yep.
It's actually one of the most damning things that has happened in like Baldur's Gate. That's like a testament of like, they say that you have choices, but really not really within the confines of like certain situations. So that's my take on it.
I think Lyrian has amply demonstrated with this game that they can put a lot of choices, that devs can put a lot of choices in these games. Now, I am of the mind that I think that some of these things in these games can be great teaching tools. Like in my own homebrew setting, I actually have, kind of one of the main conceits of my homebrew setting is that goblinoids, orcs, and humans were enslaved by elves and dwarves for thousands of years, and only like 200 years ago gained their freedom, which is a long time for the enslaved, but for dwarves and elves, it was only a generation ago. And and I use that to kind of like tell some stories about like the aftermath of slavery and racism and things like that. But I would absolutely never ever fault anyone from any marginalized group who wanted to bow out of racism, sexism, any of those other things in their entertainment, right? I never will fault anyone for wanting to do that. I think it can be a great teaching tool. So I think Lyrian has demonstrated that these options are possible. So I think there's definitely the possibility for devs in the future to consider that, hey, we're going to have some of these things in our games, but you don't have to encounter them. You can choose to check the right boxes and say, I don't want to deal with these aspects of the game. And hopefully that will become more of a thing and more of a possibility in games as we go on and as they get more sophisticated. I'm thinking back to the early days of like some very early JRPGs that I grew up on, where you had a very linear storyline. And if you did not do A, B, C, and D in that exact order, you could not progress. Period. End of story. And we've come a really long way from that. And I think this game has come a lot further than a lot of others. So hopefully they'll be able to put more of those choices in for players to make when they dive into a game.
Yeah. I want to bring up the example of I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, where that was a great game. That I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a great game.
I cried many a playthrough. Dear God.
Yeah, I full transparency, I got to look at some very early concept art, like very, very early, and I had no idea how that game was going to grow and all of those things. But when I did finally see it publicly released, I was like, oh my God, that's that game that I looked at the art for. And I saw all of the incredible things that they had done with it. One of the cool things that they did was not only have extensive content warnings, but also I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe within those content warnings, it was like, if you go down this path, you can expect to experience something like this, right? And I think by having those warnings of, if you go down this path, you can expect to experience something like this, right, is a way for devs to be kind, right? And because I am fair warned, I can and I want to opt out of that, I can choose to not, right? You're right. Mm-hmm. This is exactly the place where these conversations need to happen. This is, but people absolutely, should have the right to also be able to kind of not have to experience that if they don't want to. And I think there are ways to do that we are already seeing, so that people can experience Baldur's Gate 3. I would love to just run around in that universe. I don't, for example, I feel like there was an Assassin's Creed game that came out. I don't know if all of them do it now, but I do remember, I think it was one of them where you could just choose to just run around in that world. There was just a version where you could just sightsee. And
Origins.
The Origins. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And
yes.
That's cool. There's so much cool stuff in Baldur's Gate 3, clearly, and I would love to be able to just kind of interact with them. I don't necessarily need the plot with the racism and all that kind of stuff. I deal with that as a professional every day. I'm good, but I would love to be able to kind of let go of all of that stuff and just be able to experience that immersion and all of those cool aspects to Baldur's Gate that makes it so neat to kind of wander around in, Mm-hmm. So the options exist. They exist. People have done them and are doing them. It's just about, studios wanting to make a choice.
I think it's important to note that we're pushing back a little bit. I think we're pushing back a little bit against what's happening a lot now, where both fans and devs are aligning our games like Baldur's Gate with films. And in films, you can maybe get a content warning at the beginning and either choose whether to watch or not to watch. But it's not like you can I guess you can fast forward, right, through certain parts that you don't want to see. But there's less of an ability to say, well, I don't want this content in this series I'm about to watch, or this thing I'm about to watch. And I think we have some devs who are trying to make their games more like that type of entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a couple of schools of thought about video games and video game development and things like that. I always encourage folks to be able to give if Larian can give you this many in-game choices, I dare them, I challenge them to give you that many choices, kind of quote unquote at a game that help customize your game experience.
100%.
100%. That's just my soapbox. I'm just saying.
I totally agree with you there. Like I said, I think they've amply demonstrated, not only for themselves, they've set a bar not only for themselves but for those who follow them, the possibilities that are there of the types of choices not only that they put in the game, but the types of things that we're talking about that they've pretty much demonstrated are possible.
And like I said, they have the capacity to code in the nudity warning and allow you to edit the nudity content. They can do a lot more with that than just nudity. There are a
Yes.
lot of options. And I say this as like an asexual who's repulsed by seeing genitals. I appreciate it, but that's also kind of where I lament that a lot more could have been done. It's
Mhm,
one of those
mhm.
things.
They've clearly got the base elements there, right? Like clearly we are pointing at you guys are doing these base things right. Now take them and make them bigger. You know,
Yes.
it's doable.
Yeah.
I think there's this constant pull, though, right? Of we really want to play in these worlds. We want to have a great time. We want to be challenged, right? Sometimes we're going to be exposed to things that make us think and push us. And when we have those binary options, like, ooh, I want these binary options to really mean something if it's going to come to this.
Yeah.
And then it comes to how do we as Larian Studios make the most money?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's not by doing the things that really need sometimes, right? It's such a frustrating system to be in, right? When
Preach.
you're in Act
Yep.
2 and you find the slavers and they're enslaved and you're going through it wondering, why am I going through this? It's like, well, sorry. It's like, well, we own this property and that's part of the property and we need to put in as much of the property as we can because we own it, because that's how we're going to be most efficient with our property and the money we spent on it. You know, they're just, at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, cool, we want to learn from your games, we want these options to be meaningful, but Larian Studios is just going to pump out a really good money making machine at the end of the game, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
For what it's
Yeah.
worth, you know. I hate to be that pessimistic
if they
about
cared
it.
about the money, they'd add more races. Just saying.
Listen. So yeah, actually, low-key. Well, yes, that and two things. One, we saw Starfield add pronouns, and we saw people lose it
Yeah,
over
they
a
did.
mere pronoun. I wonder. I'm very curious. I don't know if that actually impacted their bottom line or not, but like, it's doable. You can do it. And like, yeah, you're gonna upset some people, but are the people that you're upsetting, do you really want them hanging around? You know, first of all. Second of all, yeah,
Do you want their money?
add more. Yeah, do you want their money, right? And when you do things like add more POC, add more races, when you kind of do all these things that kind of appeal to marginalized identities, your bottom line actually increases because you are now gaining profits. And this is the bit that capitalism sometimes forgets, is that you can actually increase your profit by appealing to those folks. Like, you know, I'm not appealing, like, my plea is not for capitalism because I'm not, you know, gonna do that. But I was speaking at a indie video game meetup, and that was the statistic that I showed them, was that in a study done in 2020 by Newzoo, 56% of gamers essentially say that they want to see themselves in their games. 56%, or so it was something like that. It was like just over half of all gamers want to, and it was like a base study of like 2,000 people or something like that. So there's a lot of room for growth and for people who want to see themselves in these games. So I think a lot of these companies need to really think about whose money they're accepting and how valuable is it versus the people that they will gain by making these choices, you know?
And know your audience, right? I think you need to know your audience, because if you're like a Bud Light or like a Duck Dynasty, right? You need to know like who you're catering to and who's going to be upset by what you do. And I think in the gaming world, absolutely people are open to it completely and totally, and enough that it will increase your profit margins. On that note, I do have to say, I don't know if anybody saw that Nexus Mods kicked the mod that allows you to remove pronouns off of their platform.
Yeah, I saw.
That was so good.
I saw. It was very
laughed.
based.
Yeah,
they did.
Yeah, somebody made a mod to take the pronouns out, and Nexus Mod's like, yeah, we're not hosting that.
Yeah, they did
Oh,
the same
and
thing
the
for, but it's not visible. It's not immediately
Yes.
visible, but it's
Yes.
there. So like people who complain about pronouns in Baldur's Gate have clearly not noticed the character builder having the option already to tell you to select male, female, or non-binary. So
Yes. Yep.
yeah, so I just wanted to point that out that it actually is already there. It's just that it's not immediately called out the same way Starfield does. So people don't kick up a fuss about it. And frankly, Baldur's Gate 3 is like very queer. So I think that people more appreciate it than kick up a fuss about it because
Yep.
they're like, oh, this is great. Like, I love that this thing gives me this customizable thing. It has non-binary pronouns. That's fantastic. Hardly any game acknowledges it. Then like a
True.
fuss about this. I think there was a Nexus mod that also added more pronouns because of that removing pronouns thing. Someone made a mod to add even more pronouns into it.
Yes.
Bless.
Which is spectacular.
But yeah. So just kind of adding on to that particular point. And I mean, in terms of more races, it's more like more playable races. Like I want to be a bird person, but I also want to see like a Southeast Asian person like myself be in feature in the game. Like it goes both ways. I want the skin tones to have like East Asian tones and like Blasian tones, but also why can't I play a Kenku and Era Crocker? Like you guys have birds, you can make birds, put them in the game.
Right?
Does it go back to
and also yeah.
I was gonna say, does it go back to the issue of
color?
Yeah. Sorry.
That's kind of where I was going with that. Just the inclusion of more races.
I love it.
Yeah. Does it go back to the issue of most of the cool races didn't come out until after, like last year or two? Was it?
Yeah.
There was an expansion to D&D. Kenku had been out for a while, but then they redid.
Been out for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they reworked them, and yeah.
It might. That's definitely a valid thing to say. It might, right? Timing is everything. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely something that they can improve on.
Yeah, certainly. They would, and I could easily see down the road. I don't know if anyone here has played Celasta, Crown of the Magister. It's a much smaller game, but it's a much more faithful porting of the 5e rule set for D&D. And it was originally kickstarted, the base game, and they've gradually been over since the base game came out. They've gradually been adding more of the D&D races and more of the D&D classes and other elements that weren't there in the base game. So it's certainly something that we might see down the road from Baldur's Gate 3. So.
That is very promising. And I mean, there are also people who are modding the base models to add more races. So I think I saw one that was like, I think kobolds and I'm not sure, I can't remember, but I think it was kobolds and Goliaths. So that's something that is possible. People have been modding it into the game. It's just a matter of whether or not it's supported by Larian. So it is promising that people are actually invested enough in the game to be like, if you aren't giving me the non-PHB races that aren't in the game, I'm gonna make them myself. So that's very promising. Like it shows how much people care about this game, that they want to see the change that comes into it.
Yes,
and that's great.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, Celasta, it's a cool game. It's not anywhere near as extensive as Baldur's Gate, but that game actually has a builder where people can build their own stuff for the game, and then other people can play it. It's very similar to like the earlier versions of like Neverwinter and stuff like that, where people could mod stuff. And maybe we'll see something like that for Baldur's Gate. I would really like to see them maybe one day come out with some DLC that allowed you to like play as a goblin and then rewrote some of the elements of like the Goblin Village or like some of things like that. In the context of that, I think that would be a step in the right direction to kind of like bring those things in together and start addressing some of these things maybe in a DLC down the road.
I'm curious. I feel like if it happened now and you could play Goblin, it would just be, oh, but you're the one special Goblin, aren't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no,
You're the special little guy.
Totally would be.
Yeah.
The littlest guy ever.
You're one of the good ones.
It's that little scene or side quest in the game where you're in the mountains in the first or second act, and you meet this old woman who's trying to steal this Githyanki egg, and she tells you, I know they're not all bad, but if you could just steal me one of their babies, I can raise it to be good, to be really good, because science and society.
It's actually that whole scene is very similar to a kind of like 1980s Eddie Murphy, Dan Aykroyd trading places, because she wants to take the egg because there's a group and they have a debate. The outcome of it is no better because you do end up, if you do give her the egg, you do end up encountering that them again potentially. If you go down that line, you do end up encountering them in Baldur's Gate again, and the outcome is not good. Not good.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
it's
I left their corpse at the top of the mountain exposed to the breeze. For all
fair.
Birds
totally
to pick
fair.
at.
Yeah. I just there's so much wrong with that on so many fundamental levels.
So many levels.
It hurts me. Like if you in this modern day equivalent was a white person and said, I'm gonna take that black person's baby and raise them white and see how that works. Nature versus nurture. That's fucked up. And that's what you just did.
Well, that's what happens to so many people who adopt in the quote unquote third world, right? They're like, I'm gonna take this baby from XYZ country that we bombed the shit out of. And so
it is something that we actively already do. Like these are things that actually happen IRL, and like people don't realize. You're like, oh sure, I'll just do this.
Yeah. And so that's my kind of overall, one of my biggest bones of contention about this game is that they take a lot of things that hurt or have hurt historically people of color around the world the most and present them in the game as just a choice. And as Stefan said, I think it's possible to have a conversation about these things. It's possible to have these things as learning points. And it's completely optional to not learn anything from it, other than if I kill this person, I get experience points. Or I don't know, maybe I'll just it's just curious. It's curious.
Well, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit when we were on the break, is that Larian is a Belgian studio. And as you kind of facetiously said, Larian has an excellent human rights record, or not Larian, Belgium has a great human rights record when it comes to what they did to their colonies around the world. And Belgium as a country hasn't necessarily completely grappled with that as much as maybe they should. And so I think some of that comes through when you get something coming out of a Belgian studio that they haven't grappled with some of these things maybe as much as they should have.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that it is something that I regularly come across in my work, is that we have these conversations here in North America, but they don't necessarily always translate to Europe. And it feels it's the level of difference in the conversation I have with American clients versus European clients are worlds away. I will say something to an American client and they will get it right away. I will say something to a European client and it's a little bit more of a, I gotta kind of help guide them to understand what I'm trying to say, because it's not something that they've had the opportunity or I don't know if it's the opportunity or the need, but they have not unpacked this stuff yet. And so I definitely think that the source of where this is being created, a Belgian studio, does say a lot about that. Like that does have an impact on this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to like add on to that like again, I can't give them enough props for the areas where they do get it right, because there are some places in this game where they do get it right. And given that they are a Belgian studio, and for that same reason, huge props for the places where they do get it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
truly.
I mean, if you mentioned that the quest doesn't end well, I think that Laren was also self-aware that, hey, you know, this is messed up. We want to show that it's messed up, and so if you pursue this path, as Mark, Stefan, Leona, like all of us have just been discussing all these choices,
Yeah,
it is presented as objectively a bad choice. So I think that it's actually very interesting that they added that, but also made it very clear that, hey, this is gonna suck for everyone that's involved.
I will tell you, and close your ears if you don't want spoilers. I will tell you, I kind of chuckled a little bit, but if you run through the quest line, you will find a house where the egg is hatched, and everyone who was like having this debate back and forth about nature and nurture is dead.
Lovely. Lovely. Love wins.
So, you know, I kind of had a chuckle when I ran across it. So.
Oh my lord! Yeah, I would be very curious to know how many consultants were brought on board for Baldur's Gate 3. Sincerely, because they did such a good job, and like that is worth recognizing, right? Mm-hmm. And like, you know, like if they did bring on consultants, like I am not knocking those consultants' work, because I think they did really good work thus far.
Agreed.
And it goes to show the value of having those perspectives.
Mm-hmm. The tough thing is, the consultants are showing the credits which are into the game. So if you get the whole thing, you're guaranteed to see the consultants. I'm sure the credits are in there somewhere. I want to talk to my panelists though, and thank them so much for taking part. I really appreciate your insight and your participation. I know it's so hard to come together sometimes on a Monday night, but I really appreciate all of your hard work. Is there anything y'all want to add or mention or last points before we kind of shut it down for the evening?
Well, this is my first ever stream, so hi. This is my first time doing this at all. Like,
killed it.
Welcome.
Killed it.
Welcome.
Yes. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you. So I just wanted to like mention that this is my first time, and thank you all for making me feel really welcomed and free to share my opinions. So that it has been a great experience. So thank you everyone for that. That's pretty much just all I wanted to say, that this is my complete first time that I've given it to April Chromatics. So yeah.
We're so thankful to have you.
We are here to uplift the voice of people of color all over the world, whomever. And so we love having you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Loved it. Loved your insights and your perspectives.
Thank you. Everyone did well.
More tadpoles for all, says Red said. Let's all go find tadpoles and consensually insert them into our various orifices.
Hey, so long as it's consensual, I'm
as long as it's consensual, it's okay.
Find the one tadpole who can give consent. That's a Baldur's Gate 4.
Yeah, right. Here you go. There you go.
I'm right here.
Yeah, tadpole's right there. There you go.
Let's do our outros, please. Before we get to wow.
Same order as before?
Yes, please. Leona.
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Leona. You can find me on the internet at TheLeonaMaple. The best place to find me and keep up with what on earth it is that I'm doing is TheLeonaMaple.card.co, where I try to post all of the places you can find me, the kinds of content that I'm up to, the places that I speak about, all this kind of stuff, including Chromatic Unlimited. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. I talk about this kind of stuff all day, every day. I love talking about this stuff all day, every day, and it's always a joy. So I'm very thankful to be here to talk about all of this. Yeah, I think that's all I've got.
I'm Lyndon. I use they them pronouns. You can find me on Twitter under TadpoleTalks and Blue Sky as polywag.bsky. Whatever. It's the standard bsky.social, and I mainly write. And I have a bunch of tabletop RPGs that have been published in a pay what you want basis, as well as Wormlings, which is an all ages tabletop RPG that was recently funded on Kickstarter. In the day, I'm a community manager, so I also do this for video games. And yeah, that's pretty much all from me.
And I'm Stefan, he, him, and you can find me on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Umbral_KnightX. On Blue Sky, I'm just without the underscore, UmbralKnightX. And I am a history instructor, and you will find me going on those platforms about tabletop role-playing games, social justice issues, and history of social justice, marginalized populations, and pop culture, and all that sort of fun stuff. So, and thank you so much to Mark for inviting me along on this fun little journey and conversation. That was great stuff. Great stuff.
Yeah.
I think thank
you,
Leona,
Mark, for bringing us all
specifically.
together.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
I mean,
Yeah, my
I
co-producer
had the
on
privilege
the
of. Oh, no, nothing like that. I'm just happy to help, and I'd had the opportunity to hear some of what Stefan had talked about through another upcoming apocalyptic project that I won't tell you about, but it's upcoming.
Yes.
So I knew that you had the amazing history to bring, and I was like, you know what? Let's do it, because I feel like that's just going to add so much richness to this conversation. So thank you. I'm so glad you could make it. And
Yeah,
I'm so
thank
glad to
you.
have had you as well, Lyndon. Like you were wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
amazing. So
Thank you
great.
so much.
What a great group.
I feel
Yes.
like we're mining Stefan from everything is worth, because there's another project.
You know what?
So this has been nOne-shot.
We're just
Let me-
teasing.
let
We're
me-
just teasing projects now.
Let me tell you. When I started doing role-playing games in 1977, not only was I socially ostracized for doing role-playing games, but I was also Black doing role-playing games in 1977 and the early 80s. So, you know what? I will take this as much as I can get. Like, bring it. Like, to be able to have these conversations, wider conversations, and have role-playing games see this sort of popularity, and people want to listen to these conversations, and particularly listen to POC perspectives, I'm here for it. Like, you just bring it.
I've been training for this day, for days like these. This has been nOne-shot with your host Mark J. That's me. Tomorrow on Spotify for free, there's another wonderful panel about race, racism, and Vampire the Masquerade. That's
Nice.
with Extel. That's with Stefan himself, Paul Merchant, 1B Dave Walters, and Hector, who I won't forget this time.
Great
Hector
stuff.
Reyes and myself on two wonderful panels talking about the history of Vampire the Masquerade and the issues people of color was engaging these games with the fan base and with the game itself throughout the years. They're two really powerful panels. It's rare you find 4 or 5-ish Black men willing to sit down at the same time and place and talk about their game experience and just completely nerd out. It's some of the most powerful podcasts I've done so far. And so I hope you check them out on Spotify. They're going to drop tomorrow. Woo! One sec.
Make sure you send out links so I can boost that. That was a fun time.
Links are scheduled
Yeah.
this month. They're ready
Yeah.
to rock.
It'll be on socials for sure. So tune in. And on that note, I'm gonna put those socials back in chat. So make sure you pay attention to the APOC socials.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has been another wonderful episode of nOne-shot. I really thank y'all for tuning in, man. This is my project that I've been putting together for a long time, and this means so much to anybody who watched this mess. But here at Apocalyptic, we're just here to uplift the voices of people of color like myself and like my wonderful panelists. And like a lot of you watching right now, we want you to join and participate and play games with us and participate in everything that we're doing. If you're another group doing the same thing that we're doing or similar, yo, come link up. We ain't scared. Let's party. Let's hang out. And a lot of us are going to meet together and link up at Big Bad Con next week. Ooh,
Yeah,
so having
enjoy.
said
Nice.
all
God,
that,
it's next week.
it's
What?
next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a
Be
couple
ready.
friends flying in. Like Bezu is flying in, so
Oh, yeah.
that's
Nice.
really fun. So yeah, I can't because I don't have PTO for it anymore. But I'm
Oh,
looking forward to seeing you guys next year if I can make time for it.
Yeah.
If I'm
Yes.
still
Yeah,
employed,
I'm gonna see if I can carve out some time next year too to try and make it.
yeah,
it's
because right at the beginning of the school
it's
year.
a 2-day flight for me, so I do
Oh my
have to
gosh.
budget.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
need to budget a significant amount of time for it. So that's kind of why like I don't have the PTO for it.
Yeah.
Since I'll be on
Fair.
the plane for like 1.5 days before landing.
Oh, no.
Fair.
All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Birds and nerds, have a good night and take care of yourselves. Bye.
Bye.
That was so much fun.
Oh,
So
I had a blast.